a very warm welcome to all of you to this side event today with the title Respecting and Promoting Indigenous Peoples' Rights to Lands and Self-Determination, Ensuring a Sustainable Future for All. And I will get back later to why we have called this side event this name. So, as you probably know, this is the launch of the Indigenous World, the yearbook that the International Workgroup for Indigenous Affairs, IWGIA, publishes every year, and that gives a status update on the developments and the things that happened in different countries and in international processes. And this is actually the launch of the 38th edition of this event. We have a wonderful group of panelists here today, and we are quite ambitious with regards to having many speakers, but I hope that I will anyway be able to give some time for questions at some point. If I won't be able to do that, then I'm sorry, but you can always approach us after and talk to us. I would like to start this event by really conveying a very, very big thank you to all the people that contribute to this book every year. These are authors, our authors. They are Indigenous and non-Indigenous activists and scholars, academics, people who are very much involved in the issues that report voluntarily on the situation. Some of them do that every year. Some of them are new authors. And without their contribution, we would really not be able to do this book. So first of all, a very, very big thank you. And I think many of the authors are actually sitting in this room. So thank you all very much for that. Then I would also like to thank very much my colleagues who are doing a lot of effort to edit, to compile, to proofread, to translate, and so on and so forth. So I also want to take this opportunity to thank them very much. And then, of course, not least, I would like to thank the Danish government, Denmark, very much for contributing with financial support to this yearbook every year, but also for co-sponsoring this event. So thank you very much for that. And with this, I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Erik Laursen. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Kathrin, and thank you for your opening remarks and for your introduction. Let me start by acknowledging the work that has gone into this year's permanent forum. And you know that the UN Charter opens with the words, "We, the peoples." However, often in our work here in New York, in the UN, we often feel it more like "we, the states." But the one meeting where one cannot be mistaken that the UN is also for and by the people and the peoples is during the permanent forum. And therefore, this is always a meeting that we look forward to with anticipation and with excitement. It is truly great to be able to meet so many indigenous peoples and organizations present at the UN headquarters. The permanent forum holds a special place for the Kingdom of Denmark. It provides a unique platform for the indigenous peoples of the world to come together, to exchange experiences, and to discuss progress and challenges, and also to be seen and to be heard by the world, and to speak truth to power, and to hold stakeholders accountable. Let me now turn to the launch of this year's Indigenous World book, which the government of Denmark is very proud to support through its close partnership with IWGIA. We appreciate the work that IWGIA is doing with the launch, and now it's for the 38th time. So why is this publication so important? In many ways, it serves the same purposes as the permanent forum. Firstly, like the permanent forum, it is a gold mine of information, and in itself a piece of information sharing. Secondly, like the permanent forum, it gives a voice to indigenous peoples. from all over the world who have contributed to the report, as Kathrin mentioned. This is about being seen, it is about being heard. And therefore the volume of the book is quite significant. It is hard to overlook indeed. Third, like the Permanent Forum, it holds governments accountable. It simply, in our view, has a disciplinary effect to be monitored, whether it is through interventions in the Permanent Forum or through a report like where almost all your moves as a government is being recorded, published, and disseminated. And fourthly, like the Permanent Forum, this report makes us all much wiser on an important theme every year. And it does so with solid documentation, real-life accounts, experiences from Indigenous peoples and their communities. And finally, fifth, like the Permanent Forum, this report is global in scope, and therefore it has the ability to capture more systemic and border-crossing trends and issues. And those we tend to overlook when we are not presented with aggregated knowledge like this. So for us, neither the outcome of the Permanent Forum nor this report is something that we just put on a shelf. We try to take this knowledge further in our discussions here at the UN. It helps us find relevant ways to strengthen the language in resolutions on Indigenous peoples' rights and broader themes as well. And it helps us when we look for relevant ways to keep the rights of Indigenous peoples on the agenda in the United Nations. So the knowledge that the report provides really qualifies our work here. It helps us understand the themes and challenges we need to bring forward in our discussions among both states, with and within the UN system, and civil society in the broader sense. And we are making small, incremental steps here at the UN. So often it can actually be seen as quite a tedious and slow process. And that's probably not a totally inaccurate observation. But we do see progress in some areas. And this also goes for the past year. Let me highlight a few of these. The resolution on Indigenous peoples that is presented every year in the third committee is very important. Last year, we once again managed to defend important language on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And we also managed to add new references to the important General Recommendation number 39 on the rights of Indigenous women and girls of the CSW, as well as keeping the process on enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples at the UN alive. Further, we are pleased that the President of the General Assembly this February appointed the permanent representatives of Canada and Peru as co-facilitators to conduct consultations on possible further measures necessary to enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples at the United Nations. We also welcome the two recently appointed advisors from Indigenous peoples to the process, and we look forward to the informal consultation tomorrow. This is progress, and to continue to keep pushing for progress, we need the qualified input and knowledge that we see in the report working on these issues. Thank you for that. Finally, let me turn to the theme of this year's report, which really is a testament to the intertwined nature of the issues that Indigenous peoples face. I would like to highlight that Indigenous peoples' rights to land, territories, and resources play a key role in managing the risks and impacts of climate change, protecting biodiversity, and achieving sustainable development. It is therefore quite worrying to read in this year's The Indigenous World that an increasing number of attacks are being detected against defenders of the lands and forests that are being exploited by extractive industries, agribusinesses, or even so-called green energy projects. We are deeply concerned about the alarming violations of the rights of Indigenous peoples in protected nature areas, where an exclusionary approach to protecting biodiversity not only risks worsening our planetary crisis, but also has led to forced evictions, violence, and killings of Indigenous human rights defenders. Indigenous women and girls, including female human rights defenders, face a multifaceted degree of violence, including sexual violence, rape, harmful traditional practices, trafficking, and child marriage. Often they are also excluded in decision and policy making. It is crucial that concrete steps are taken to include the needs of women and girls in political processes and to guarantee their safety and effective participation and consultation in areas established in the CEDAW General Recommendation 39. All states have a responsibility to protect human rights, including Indigenous peoples. And the rights of Indigenous peoples must be respected and applied in the context of lands, territories, and resources. Indigenous peoples must be recognized not only as stakeholders and partners, but as rights holders to their traditional lands and territories and in decisions affecting their rights, their lands, their resources, their livelihoods, and food security. If we fail to respect, protect, and promote the rights of Indigenous peoples, we not only fail in protecting human rights for all, we also fail in our efforts to secure the health of our planet. So thank you, IWGIA, for making Indigenous peoples' rights to lands, territories, and resources the theme of this year's report. This handbook and the knowledge you provide us with is crucial also here at the United Nations, and it will continue to be so in the years to come. I look forward very much to the discussions today and to continue our cooperation on promoting and protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. Thank you, Kathrin.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And indeed, of course, our cooperation goes far beyond the yearbook. And I'm really glad that we can stand together and be allies together to support Indigenous people's rights. Thank you very much. And that is very important, in, as you said, all the processes that are coming up in the UN, but also on the ground to really stand together for Indigenous peoples. And with this, I would like to give the floor to our second opening speech to Mr. Darío José Mejía Montalvo, who all of you know. He's a member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and has actually been the chair in the last 2 years. So Darío, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for coming.
Muchas gracias, Kathrin, por...
Thank you very much, Kathrin, for this invitation, and to IWGIA for all the work they are always doing, and also thank you, Ambassador, for your words, for your support and your contributions, and mostly because of your commitment and your conviction. Indeed, last year we were also in the launch of the previous version of this book. At that occasion, it was a mention about the importance of the publications of IWGIA, and also from my own experience in my childhood when I started my readings about matters that affected Indigenous peoples, I could see that there were other peoples all over the world, and perhaps this nature of IWGIA still is alive, and I think it's something exceptional because it goes beyond the speed at which states progress recognizing Indigenous peoples. And I was now reviewing the list of countries that make their reports, and I see that there are many countries where still the states didn't yet take the step to recognize constitutionally and legally the Indigenous peoples in their territories. And in spite of that, these peoples still they report and report to IWGIA. And this is something that is a quite essential element, because it allows us to have access to this information by means of this channel. Even if the states themselves did not progress in their legal standards, and in consequence they don't progress in the establishing of mechanisms for the capture and the production of differentiated information about their own peoples, as they are very often categorized in a different way. And that is a permanent challenge. It is a challenge we have in front of us as part of the discussions of the present session of a permanent forum. Even if the presentation, the publication of IWGIA, this publication is focused on the territorial rights. In this case, the territorial rights are very related, very linked to the right to self-determination. And everyone on each of the moments of history has its speciality. And everybody may have a different opinion about what an historic moment it may be, depending on how he or she has lived it. In this particular moment we are living in, this is a moment that is crucial, not only for indigenous peoples, but also for the rest of the social sectors and also for the rest of the different collectivities. But in general, also for humanity itself. We are now facing the consequences of our own actions. We can't say that the climate is changing, that the problem is the climate. No, actually what is happening is the climate, and I've said it several times, is the language that Mother Earth uses in order to show us humans how to live on her surface, because she shows us when to seed, when to harvest, when to warm us up, when to gather the fruits. And this is a language that is more or less standardized, and we can speak among us many different languages. But Mother Earth also speaks her language with us, and that is what is being modified now by our own actions, by the emission of different gases that pollute and modify the climatic cycles. And the immediate consequences of this are the elementary crisis, the energetic crisis, the environmental crisis, and also the modification of these cycles that do not take account the frontiers or the borders. They don't differentiate between different identities or poverty in the global south or the global north, or even in the states themselves. So this crisis is affecting all of us. And so the reserves of the planet, in order to balance out this life on itself, are mostly in these indigenous territories. And indigenous territories are not exerting, they are not having the capacity of determining the use in the future of these resources that are still existing in their territories. This is the moment, this is a crucial moment, this is the characteristics that determines why this moment of history is crucial, because all the stakeholders in these debates, now finally after decades, after having the Western science saying that there was a risk of climate change, a climate crisis, finally states are accepting that this crisis is real. And even their own scientists, finally they see that they were right. And now, since we are now, as I said, they are now being aware of this, now trying to get solutions. But solutions based on what? The solution, the immediate solutions, the short-term solutions, are those that affect less their institutions, their interests, already predetermined in these decades and all these centuries before. So, and the capital is one of their interests. That has been that has a way of measurement that is very particular. The value, and what is the value? Nowadays, it's a word that defines all societies all over the world. That defines us even even what we take at breakfast, what we eat at breakfast, the way of walking at the street, all this is determined by the word or the expression word. What is word? For some it's a economic capacity, the political power, it's a capacity of pollution, if I have more or less cars driving on the streets. All these are values. But for us, for indigenous peoples, what is value for us? For us, value is a capacity of taking care of nature, of taking care of life, even of other beings. That is the value of keeping this balance. And the global discussions nowadays are having place about this idea of what value is. Because for some states, value means the capacity of indebting themselves. For others, it's the capacity of having political or military capacity. But even like this, even like that, they don't listen to each other. But they're not having a look at the other perspective. And that is something that is fundamental. To get into the political dialogues. Permanent forum allows this kind of conversations. And it allows that the states express what they consider they are doing properly. Also, the different agencies or the different bodies of the United Nations are having a follow-up all of the multilateral agreements that are behind all this. And all this we see their voices, but on the terrain they are still at the forefront of these actions of the creativity. I used to say that in these times of crisis, innovation is fundamental. But what is the best innovation? The best innovation is very often to get back to the origin, of how things are or were. The origins, that is what we say as indigenous peoples in the region. Get back to the origins or to the source is the best innovation perhaps in times of crisis. And there we are at this moment where we are. We badly need to listen to each other. And with this, I want to finish my intervention, Kathrin. We had a international meeting of the group of experts fostered by the mechanism, and we had this study, and I want to share this with you now. That basically, what it identifies as part of the discussion, this international group, is that the states are speaking about different solutions in order to catch up with this crisis, and they are modifying the concepts of sustainable development, incorporating concepts like green economy, like just transition, nature-based solutions, creative ideas, very beautiful ideas, but it's as if you were going to a celebration, to a feast, and suddenly you notice that the dresses you wear are not the adequate ones for the celebration, and that perhaps you should put something else with gayer colors or whatever, because you may be more attractive or you are more visible during the celebration. That is what is happening nowadays. It means changing the mask of what we see or want to see, how to conquer more adepts, how we can bring more unconscious people on our side of the fight for survival on the planet. And at the same time, we continue with the capital, destroying everything with the same project, this investment project, with this project without free, prior, informed consent, with this way of dressing that is now dressed in green. And that is something that we have to be conscious about, and specifically indigenous people that are on at the basis, because the metrics, the ideologic metrics of the indigenous peoples is also a patrimony, and it has to be kept, because it's what has given us the place where we are. And the second one is that the solutions also generated in climate change are generating impacts, very negative impacts. Not all the impacts are negative, obviously, but there are some of them that are really outstanding. For instance, the carbon markets. The carbon markets are generating a great division, lots of dependence, and even subtraction of the right to free determination of self-determination, with contracts that have a term of 50 years or even 1 century, that doesn't allow the indigenous peoples to develop their right to indigenous to self-determination. They are enforced, of course. They have to be admitted. There are some states that are speaking about constitutional reforms, legal reforms, and also the corporation that is also speaking out ideas of direct financing of indigenous people. And all these are interesting steps that merit to be applauded and to underline, and that IWGIA sure is going to register in its publication. For us, it's something. It's always your work. The work with you, IWGIA, is something really outstanding. Thank you very much, and thank you.
Very much, Darío, and as always, you give us such a rich context and such a lot of in content to the discussions that we have, and you put in questions, no? What kind of solutions do we want? What kind of changes we want? And then really, how do we really base this again into the issue of self-determination? And that's also, I want to say that as the previous speakers have mentioned and taken a little bit in advance, is that this issue of the indigenous world is focusing on the right of indigenous peoples to land, territories, and resources, which is really a central part to self-determination. And I mean, every year, almost all articles are actually focusing on the rights of indigenous peoples to land, territories, and resources. But we nevertheless thought that it would be important this year to really also put an editorial focus on that and to really reinforce the importance of this issue in the indigenous world. And before I give the floor to our next speaker, I just also want to tell you a bit more about the book. So this year's edition includes 54 country reports and 17 reports from international and regional processes and initiatives and mechanisms. And we make a very big effort to include as many countries as possible every year. But I also want to say that some countries are, of course, not included. And just because a country is not included in this report doesn't mean that there are no indigenous peoples in this country or that there haven't been any important processes. It simply means that we haven't been able to get an article about that country. And I also want to stress, and I think the ambassador also mentioned that topic already, that in some cases it is because it's simply dangerous to write about indigenous peoples' issues and of what has happened. And we can't get anyone to write without exposing them to potential threats and danger. So that's also a reason why some countries are not covered in the indigenous world. And now, going back to this year's edition, I am very happy to introduce you to Elsa Stamatopoulou, who has been a member of IWGIA's board since 2020, and who will provide you with a bit of a broader contextual overview of indigenous peoples' rights to land, territories, and resources. Elsa has been a professor at Columbia University since 2011, and after 31 years of service at the United Nations, with some 22 years dedicated to human rights, in addition to 8 years exclusively devoted to indigenous peoples' rights. Elsa was the first chief of the Secretary of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2003, and she's now the first director of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Program at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. And Elsa, it's really a great pleasure to have you here. You're sitting so far away from me, but the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kathrin, and good afternoon, dear friends. Let me first recognize the indigenous peoples of this land, the Lenape people, who are the traditional owners of the land where the United Nations finds itself, its headquarters here in this big, beautiful building. I would like to really congratulate with all my heart the amazing IWGIA team for producing again this extremely precious book, you know, The Indigenous World 2024. And I want to also congratulate and thank Kathrin, the executive director, for such a wonderful and graceful introduction. In my remarks, dear friends, I will give a context, as Kathrin mentioned, to the right to lands, territories, and resources, and explore 3 points and give some examples. The first point is, what is the significance of the right for this right for the survival of indigenous peoples, and what are the related problems indigenous peoples face? So from the beginning of the international indigenous movement in the 1970s and consistently since then, indigenous peoples have been stressing the significance of lands, territories, and natural resources for their cultural, physical, and spiritual survival. According to their worldviews, cosmovisiones, the land does not belong to us humans. We belong to the land, to our Earth Mother that cares for us and sustains us and all living things. During the debates on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they therefore explained why for them land rights are not the same as private property rights, and that therefore this needed to be recognized boldly in the declaration. What were and are the problems that indigenous peoples face regarding lands? Here is a typology of problems. I put them in 9 categories. 1, land grabbing by companies, individuals, or the state itself. And even if it's not the state itself, the state has encouraged and facilitated this by explicit laws and policies, or the lack of those. Second, prohibition of the use of indigenous lands and waters for subsistence economic activities such as fishing and hunting, for instance, in the Russian Far East and in the USA's Alaska. 3, pollution that erodes indigenous peoples' lands and indigenous peoples' health. That includes nuclear and other toxic dumping, Russia, USA, and toxic pesticides in many countries. 4th, militarization of indigenous peoples' lands, controlling the lands, eroding indigenous peoples' authority, and threatening indigenous peoples. Bangladesh, Indonesia. 5, non-recognition of collective ownership of land, privatization of land, thus making the sale of the land easier and eroding the community's survival as such. Mexico, Ecuador. 6, mega projects such as dams, artificial lakes, mining, logging, etc. Peru, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Brazil. 7, outright settlement of indigenous lands by the state, bringing in settlers and promoting change in the demographic composition of the area, Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh. 8, declaration of indigenous areas as nature conservation areas or as cultural heritage of humanity, Tanzania, leading to the clearing, so-called, of the areas from the indigenous people, Botswana with the San people, Guyana, Meridians, Argentina. 9, expansion of the so-called biofuels or ethanol cultivations such as oil palm in Asia, corn or sugarcane in the Americas. What are the impacts of these problems? Massive uprooting and displacement of indigenous peoples, conflict and loss of life, rape of women and girls, loss of the cultural and spiritual base of the indigenous peoples, and thus threat to their survival as specific cultures and groups. Threat of physical and cultural extinction, loss of health remedies, and overall deterioration of health, impoverishment, and further marginalization. Second point, what are the international norms for indigenous people's right to lands, territories, and resources? And here we go straight to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we should state that lands, territories, and resources is one of the 3 pillars of the declaration, the other 2 being right to self-determination and, of course, cultural rights. And each of these rights pillars has a conglomeration of articles around it, and they're all interlinked, of course, as Kathrin also said. In asking myself what are the special points that indigenous peoples have made us think about in human rights, the most comprehensive answer I can give is breaking the taboo of the dominant until recent times human rights doctrine and recognizing collective human rights in addition to individual human rights, of course. collective rights are human rights for indigenous peoples because they go to the core of their human dignity. They aim to promote their survival as human groups, culturally, spiritually, and often even their physical survival. So the main points on land rights in the Declaration: non-discrimination is a major focus. Protection of property, as we know, is a well-recognized right around the world. Democratic states have laws that provide, for instance, for compensation if the state has to expropriate privately held land for public purposes, for example, to build a road. However, as we know, indigenous peoples have historically been deprived of their lands without being consulted and without being compensated. The legal violence of colonialism, the dominant culture's legal system, treated them as not there and took their lands. We recall, of course, the concept of terra nullius, the empty lands. So the recognition of land rights in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is bringing back the dignity that was taken away from indigenous peoples. In other words, it's an issue of equality. The Declaration also recognizes subsistence rights as part of land rights and provides that peoples deprived of their means of subsistence and development are entitled to just and fair compensation. And there are many articles in the Declaration that are relevant to land rights. I can read only two because of lack of time. Article 10, which is about prohibition of forced removal. Indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement on just and fair compensation, and where possible with the option to return, unquote. And Article 26 is the bold declaration of indigenous peoples' right to land. And I quote, "Indigenous peoples have the right to lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. States shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources, and such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the indigenous peoples concerned." So we see here the elements of legal pluralism that inspire the Declaration. Some cases, for instance, in Latin America, can be mentioned, some good moments. The Aguas Tigni versus Nicaragua case in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights was the first indigenous-related case in an international court where the Mayanya community was recognized that they have the right to their lands. In December 2008, the government completed a process of demarcating and titling the land, giving them title to a total of more than 73,000 hectares. In national case law, just to capture some good moments, in 2015, the highest appellate court in Belize rendered a landmark decision known as the April 22, 2015 consent order that affirmed the rights of the Maya peoples of southern Belize to their lands and territories, and the declaration was used in that case. And major areas of Brazil, to go to Brazil, have been demarcated for indigenous peoples over the years. For example, the Yanomami lands have been demarcated. And we should note that in all these international fora where indigenous peoples participate, whether on environment, climate change, development, or human rights, they always bring up the rights that are on lands, territories, and resources that are recognized in the declaration. And in 2007, the Permanent Forum focused its special theme on lands, territories, and resources and adopted a group of very good, solid recommendations. Finally, briefly, some questions and ways ahead. Conflict of rights connected to land rights. What form can this take? What are some legitimate conflicts that can arise? What solutions? How to implement the declaration, assuming a well-meaning state that wants to take care of all the people. Criteria for land expropriation, this is my last comment. In most legal systems, land expropriation are, one, conditions for expropriation are prescribed in law, right? By law. Okay, fine. Two, legitimate aim that the state has to prove of why it wants to expropriate. Okay. Third is proportionality. It means what the owner of the land loses should be proportionate to what is won, right, for the public interest. So this last criterion of proportionality can almost never apply to indigenous peoples, for whom land is not for sale, as it has a profound significance for material, spiritual, cultural, for their very survival. And in conclusion, how the declaration helps solve problems? It starts from recognizing rights to lands, territories, and resources. It gives us methodology of dealing with conflicts. Indigenous peoples must be consulted. They have to be represented by their own representative authorities. Free, prior, and informed consent is required. Relocation must not take place without that free, prior, and informed consent, if at all. I finish by saying that we continue to be inspired by indigenous people's struggles for self-determination, for land, and for nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elsa, for this very rich and systematic and broad overview and of the issue, and of course also for making these good references to the UN Declaration. And we all know that even if the rights to land, territories, and resources are recognized, or there are even court cases that have been ruled in favor of indigenous peoples, we all also know that there is still a very big implementation gap, which we have also discussed. And we will also dig into into many of the elements that you have mentioned in your presentation, in the following presentations, when we go a little bit more at the national level, at the level of indigenous peoples' territories. And I also want to mention, of course, this issue is also mentioned in all the reports elaborated by UN Permanent Forum members to this meeting. So it is, of course, a very central issue. And with this, I would like to go to four panelists here that will help us to understand a bit more the situation at the national level or at the level of indigenous peoples' territories. And we will start with the Arctic region. And I'm very happy to welcome Erik Larsen today, who is the author of the article on Sámi. Erik is a lawyer and the head of the Human Rights Unit at the Sámi Council. And Erik previously served as an advisor to the two most recent presidents of the Sámi Parliament in Norway, and he has also been an advisor to the Norwegian government on Sámi and indigenous issues. Thank you, Erik, for joining us. Now, the right to land, territories, and resources is, of course, also a big issue in Sápmi. And recently, we have all read about this in relation to particularly the green transition or green colonialism, as one can maybe also call it. And please tell us a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a privilege to contribute to the yearbook and also to speak here at the launch event. And thank you for giving me the floor a few minutes after my former law associated professor entered the room. So this will be a new exam to me. So perfect timing. I would like to share some brief words about the main reason why we see so many land disputes in the Sámi territories, and namely the climate crisis, as my brother Darío spoke of. So in the Arctic context, we face accelerating climate change, and as many of you are aware of, the Arctic region stands as one of the front lines, witnessing the unprecedented pace and scale of environmental changes. So the Sámi people are inhabitants of these lands and are confronting profound challenges to our way of life as temperatures rise and ecosystems shift. So our traditional livelihoods are under threat due to climate change, meaning our whole culture is at risk, our food system is at risk, health issues. I also want to just to underscore that the land carries our culture. Even our languages are depending on land. So that's why it's so important for us to maintain the possession of our land and to be able to continue with our livelihoods, because it's more than just the use of land. Our whole culture is carried by the land. So in my article I have touched upon the term green colonialism, which is quite common in the Nordic context to use that term. So the reason why we use that term is that the Sámi people, as many indigenous peoples, are highly affected by climate change itself, but also by land encroachments, justified by governments and companies with the urgent need for a green transition, and that's why just transition is such an important agenda for many of the meetings where indigenous people are seated at the table. So on the one hand, the Sámi are among the people most affected by climate change. On the other hand, the Sámi is expected to also carry the burden of mitigation and to allow land encroachment in their remaining land. And the newly or the EU Critical Raw Material Act will even increase the land pressure on Sámi lands. One of the issues I have written about in my article is the Fosen case, which is quite famous worldwide, I believe, and many of the Sámi delegation has been speaking on this issue for many years already. So I'm really happy to receive this opportunity to explain the issue from the beginning to the end, to the current status in English, and so it will be available for more than Nordics languages. So that's a great opportunity. So I'm not sure if I have time to walk into this case, but of course I will recommend to read the yearbook. But the latest development is that, of course, the Sámi they won. It was a massive win for the Sámi people when the wind power plants in the Fosen Peninsula was judged invalid, the licenses. So the lack of follow-up made Sámi youth furious, and we saw civil disobedience, which finally led the government to admitting human rights violation and to give a public apology. So there has been mediations, and in the yearbook it's reflected about the first settlement from one of the communities. There are two communities who is affected. So one of them went into an agreement in December, and the last one went into agreement quite recently. So that's not reflected in the book. But what they have achieved was for the government to allocate new land for them. So they haven't received the new land, but the government is working on it, and also, of course, economic compensation. And maybe the most important thing, they have a right to veto after the end of the license for the current wind power plant. So it's approximately 20 years left, and after the 20 years, both of the communities have the right to veto So they decide the future of the land after 20 years. But of course, there are like massive the land is not in a condition to be used straight away. So there will be many decades before the land has the same quality as it had. So this is a winter grazing area, and the winter grazing area is the most crucial one for reindeer herding industry because I'll leave it with that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Erik. And as Erik said, you can, of course, read more about this in his article. And I guess we will get an update next year as well, so that we can really keep on reporting on that case. Thank you so much. And for the sake of time, because we're running a bit short, I will immediately go to our next speaker, who is Chandra Tripura, a human rights activist and social entrepreneur from the Tripura indigenous community of the Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh. Chandra is leading a youth-led homecoming movement back to the roots in Bangladesh, and she is the youth representative to the Executive Council of Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, AIPP. Very warm welcome to you, Chandra. And of course, it's great to have you on board as well, because youth is one of the themes also for this year's permanent forum. So I'm really interested in hearing a bit more about how land rights are important for the youth movement in your country.
Thank you so much, Kathrin. I'm very honored to be a part of this amazing panel and to represent my indigenous young brothers and sisters from Asia. Of course, other 6 sociocultural regions as well. Yes, I really appreciate for appreciating indigenous youth's contributions to the indigenous peoples movement around the world. And I really would like to thank the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for making us the core of this whole movement and dedicating the theme on indigenous youth. Well, we all know that to indigenous peoples, how land is important to us. Land is our life, of course, and without our ancestral land and territories, it is very difficult to breathe and even live. And our life, our whole way of life, our thinking, everything starts from our ancestral land, from our territorial land. Because land actually shape our unique perspectives as indigenous. The collective ownership, the collectiveness we learn from our communities, from our elders, that actually we received it from the whole essence of land rights and our indigenous peoples movement. So land rights is definitely the core of our self-determination movement. And it is more important for our indigenous youth and our indigenous youth movement because it determines both our present and future. At the same time, our future generation that will come in future. So it is a huge matter of concern for all of us, especially indigenous youths. And it is crucial for us as it leads to our other rights, such as quality education for our indigenous children and youths, better health facilities for us, all indigenous peoples. It is also leads to our rights, right to protect and maintain our culture, as well as to develop our culture in our own way, not by other ways. And to right to self-determination and to live in harmony with nature as we worship the nature. We don't say that we own the nature or the forest or our land for commercial interest or any other interest. We worship our land and nature. We protect it as we protect to our parents, our elders, our ancestors. it is, very difficult to shape our mind with indigenous wisdom. If with indigenous wisdom, indigenous norms, and indigenous values and principles, if we don't have the right or opportunity to live physically, I would say, emotionally, I would say, in our own indigenous territories. And we already, seeing the evidence that the difference, between those indigenous youths who are living in the city areas, who are compelled to live in the city areas, who are compelled to migrate to other countries in abroad, and with those who are living in our territories, in our indigenous territories. Because it's very difficult to have that essence, to have that realization, if we don't live there, if we don't get that opportunity to be with our community, to learn from our elders, to learn from our community, and to continue the practices that our elders, that our ancestors have been practicing for centuries. So the realization of indigenous youths is very important, and especially for land rights movement and our self-determination movement. And another issue is intergenerational, which is very important for us to keep our existence alive as indigenous peoples, and also our way of life, our culture, our livelihoods, everything. But is it even possible without land, without indigenous peoples, territories, and ancestral land? If we don't have our land, will our healing system, or the traditional medicine that we make, that our elders make, is it possible to make? Because the materials comes from the nature, comes from forest. So I actually had an opportunity to talk with one of our traditional healer. I asked him, how many of your young community in your village, know how to make traditional medicine for these purposes? And sadly, he answered, no one. He is the last one in that community, in that village, who knows how to make traditional medicines, who is the only one who knows the healing system. And I asked him, is it you who is not transferring the knowledge to the young community, or is it them who is not interested anymore? And he answered that it's not me, it's not them, it's the whole situation. Because we don't have our land, we don't have our forest anymore because of deforestation, in the name of development, in the name of tourism, and even higher education, facilities, and for other many reasons. So that's why we indigenous youth, we feel, we have this strong feeling that how indigenous people's land and territories is important to us to keep our identity alive, to continue the legacy. Because without that, without our own land and territories, it's impossible to, keep us alive as indigenous. Even I ask myself sometimes, am I becoming only physically indigenous person, not ideologically indigenous? So I even ask myself this question, and to some other youths. Because we are in a crisis, in a situation where we feel identity crisis, where we have, this generational trauma that we have been carrying. This is a huge burden for us indigenous youths. And now with this just transition, or the debate of just transition or green transition, and the other globalization impacts and the climate change, climate crisis, it is very difficult for us. So for indigenous youth, definitely land rights is very important. And however, the land rights issues is a burning issue for us all. At the same time, the question I'd like to end with this answer: that what future Indigenous youths are dreaming, what future we want. We actually want that future where we can shape our both present and future of our future generation without any fear and threats, and ensure our self-determination rights for all Indigenous peoples around the world. So I'd like to thank, of course, Kathrin and IWGIA for giving us this opportunity and working with Indigenous youths as always, and we believe that you will continue your work and partnership with Indigenous youths. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chandra. And we might want to focus one of the future Indigenous worlds on Indigenous youth, in fact. So, yeah, thank you so much, Chandra. I'm going immediately forward to the next speaker, who is Edward Porokwa. I'm very happy that you're here too, Edward. Edward is also an author to the book, and he's a Maasai lawyer and the director of the organization Pingos Forum, who's a long-term partner of IWGIA as well. And Edward, your article actually on Tanzania almost entirely reports on the issue of rights to land, territories, and resources in your country. So I'm really looking forward to hear a bit more also here at this side event about this.
Thank you, Kathrin. It is a pleasure again to be in this launching of the yearbook. I think this is my second launching. I've been contributing to an article in the yearbook for several years. But for me, before I even talk about Tanzania, I would like to talk about the yearbook. It has really been a learning tool for many of the Indigenous people, and it has been a reference in many of the issues and comparing what is happening in different countries, and also learning and giving a voice to Indigenous people in different aspects. And this is a really important avenue for Indigenous people to reflect and try to analyze and synthesize what is happening and exposing the situations in their particular countries. And I really congratulate IWGIA for this great work. Now, coming to the situation in my country, and particularly in many of the similar countries in Africa, Indigenous people, livelihood and future has been very fragile. And the major global policies that are determined very far here in New York or in Geneva and other places have been having direct impact, negative impact on the Indigenous people. We are talking globally about the issue of mitigation of climate change with elimination of Indigenous people, and that is what is happening. We are suffering as Indigenous people on climate change mitigation than climate change itself. Evictions are taking place in the name of climate change. Violations of human rights are taking place in the name of climate change. And also we are talking of other big issues like World Heritage Site without, and World Heritage without heritage of Indigenous people. We are not part of the World Heritage. In fact, the World Heritage is dangerous for us. The whole concept of having the World Heritage, the whole concept of having national interest. We are not part of the beneficiaries of the national interest, because once there is something that is called public or national interest, it means land grabbing, it means eviction of Indigenous people, it means violation of the rights of the people, it means loss of life, impoverishment, it means a lot of serious situations that are happening on the ground in Indigenous people's land. As we speak now, Tanzania is a champion of conservation, where over 45% of the country is conservation. But what does conservation mean to Indigenous people? Does it mean their continued existence? Does it mean their loss of life? Does it mean the expansion of the protected areas, forest conservation that alienate land from them? This is a very serious issue because once you talk about conservation, it is not conservation. It is about business. It is about business and tourism. It means about hunting of the biodiversity that we have been keeping for centuries at the expense of the people. It is a conservation in the current term, which is supported, unfortunately, by the global community, eliminate indigenous people from their land. It means now we have to change to become something else. Indigenous people need collective ownership of their resources. They need their own livelihood, and they have been the custodians of that biodiversity for many years. But now, when you talk of conservation, it means forcing them to live in isolation with their nature. It means complete change of their culture. It means complete change of identity. So we are changing identity. We are becoming what we don't know what it is, to an extent that the situation on the ground is really terrified. We have a lot of victims of climate change interventions. We have so many victims of World Heritage Sites. We have so many victims of climate change mitigation who are subject of the actions supported globally by finance and financed by states to ensure that we are losing our stability as indigenous people. This yearbook, the yearbook, has been one of the exposing opportunity to this, because we are talking, for example, in Tanzania, eviction of indigenous people. We have had several evictions. We are expecting more to come with very little intervention by the global community. And we are talking of the indigenous people losing their land. We are talking of increased poverty of indigenous people in the name of conservation, in the name of world heritage, in the name of public interest. All these are subject to the situation that we are currently see. We see a lot of discrimination taking place and action taking place solely targeting indigenous people because they are the ones with resources already. So with this short or long presentation, I would like to end up there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edward. And I'm so sorry that I have to interrupt you. I have been so bad at keeping time, but I really want to also give the opportunity to Darío to make her presentation. And now I have lost my note. No. Darío Lero Quispe, who is from the Sura Nation in Bolivia, so we're going to Bolivia now. And Darío is an activist and defender of indigenous peoples' rights, women's rights, and democracy. And she's currently also a member of the Bolivian parliament. So, Darío, it's really good to have you here as well. And I'm really interested in hearing a bit more about the challenges that indigenous women face with regards to the rights to land and territories. So thank you very much for joining.
Before leaving in order to participate here at the Permanent Forum, I received the claim of 6 women from the community of Totoral Chico that had been aggressed, abused, and humiliated by 200 miners. Mining workers. They were just defending the last bits of what was left of their territories. In the last bits of territory that were left to be delivered to the next generation. It is really difficult situation. And that was their complaint. And that is what we women are doing in our territory. And that's, and I want to say to IWGIA, thank you for giving me the opportunity of being present today and being part of this forum. I know IWGIA, and it has been already more than 28 years that they have been accompanying all the indigenous peoples all over the world. And yes, of course, there have been changes, also backlashes, but we have to continue fighting, we have to continue with our struggle, we have to resist. It is not only Darío who is here now in the parliament. It was also a very important decision with all the defenders of rights, because we don't have to forget that at the same measure as technology progresses, industrialization progresses, also we have loss of values. Sometimes it's not anymore easily to be understood who is leftist, rightist. It's like as if power, capitalism, and all these things we are speaking about has overpassed the limits of all these ideologies. And what is left to us as women is to struggle for reproduction of life, for the defense of the material means of construction or building up of our cultures, to fight for our seeds, for the soil, for the earth, where all the knowledges are reproduced, the medicinal plants, all these knowledges. So the decision was a collective decision, in the sense that we have to arrive at Parliament in order to have a space, space of resistance, a trench of resistance from which we can visibilize the voice of indigenous peoples, since we have lost our organic autonomy as indigenous peoples. Sometimes it's easier to endorse all the laws. A new constitutional law, for instance, like the one of the plurinational state of Bolivia, with the right to ancestral territories, the right to self-determination. But it's really difficult, sometimes even impossible, to progress towards this project of indigenous peoples, because we as peoples have struggled for the construction of intercultural societies, in order to construct bridges of interculturality, in order to understand each other and to live well together. But it's not easy to take this path. So from this trench, we have to see and manage and inspect how all these things are taking place. We have to accompany our processes. So the challenge of indigenous women, because of being mothers, because of having this identity and this identification as water women, and I say this because water is a very, very basic, fundamental element for us. What I want to say with this, I know this theme is I don't have very much time, but the right to self-determination is the most important right we aspire to as indigenous peoples. We indigenous women want to enjoy this right. But if in these new times we see so many threats, and not only many threats, even a process of extinction of indigenous peoples, our young people who are going to here are not going to be able to enjoy this right to self-determination. That is why we women are resisting in order to leave something behind us, some wisdom, some knowledge, and all the things that are materialized on our territories. I don't want to bother you more. This book reveals all these facts. There it is. You can really read it there, all about our books. But we can't stand back. We have to continue. Thank you very much, Kathrin, for giving us this opportunity. Let's read the book and let's analyze it. The book of the Indigenous World. Thank you very much.
very strong words. And I also want to say our last Indigenous World last year focused actually on Indigenous women. So you can also go back to that version. Before I give the floor to Casey for some final remarks, I just want to say that you can pick up a copy of the Indigenous World here after the event. Please only take one. There are many people who would like to have a copy. So please, one copy for each person. So Casey is from the Christensen Fund. I'm losing my notes here, but Casey has been a long ally for Indigenous peoples, and it's really nice to have you here as well.
Thank you, Kathrin. I think the Indigenous World is symbolic of why the Christensen Fund has been supporting IWGIA since 2012. It's symbolic because it represents the deep relationships and trust it's built with its partners and communities around the globe, with 54 regional and country supports. It's symbolic because of the deep commitments and attentions it's made to international processes, with 17 deep analysis. As co-chair of the Forest Tenure Funders Group, the group of donors that signed the $1.7 billion pledge in Glasgow, I know well that its analysis informs donors' strategies and its commitments, and hopefully encourages other donors to step up and support Indigenous peoples not only more, but in better ways. Most importantly, I think it equips Indigenous organizations and communities with a critical tool to advocate for their rights. On behalf of the Christensen Fund, I want to join others in congratulating IWGIA and its team and all those that contributed to this year's report. It's absolutely amazing that you've continued with 38 editions. Please join me in congratulating IWGIA once again on the published launch of the 38th edition of the Indigenous World. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Casey, for these nice final words, and thank you all panelists. It's been great to have you here, and sorry, no time for questions, but you just reach out after the event. Thank you all for coming. It's great that you have been here.